Welcome to the Performance Enhancing Podcast. It's like steroids for your brain. A podcast for people that want the best info, but just don't have the time. Get your podcast fix with the Cliff Notes versions of your favorite podcasts. No fluff, just the actionable golden nuggets. Having this much knowledge at your fingertips should be downright illegal. So get ready for another dose of Performance Enhancing Podcast with SatoriPrime. Here's your host, Ilan Ferdman.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another Performance Enhancing Podcast episode with Ilan Ferdman, co-founder of SatoriPrime. And today we're going to wrap up our trilogy of Joe Navarro's What Everybody is Saying. Feedback I've gotten on the first two have been absolutely amazing, and I'm probably certain it's because most of us have never even heard of something like this or never been taught it to this amount of depth. So I'm really excited to share this with you and kind of complete the book for myself and for you guys. And I just want to let you know, if you have any follow-up questions specifically about the book, things that were still unclear or things that you want to learn more about, just leave a comment in iTunes, and I check those all the time. I'll be more than happy to reply to you guys. And also, if you want, you can leave it in the comment section of the actual podcast, okay? So if you missed parts 1 and 2 of Joe Navarro, who's an ex-FBI agent, who's actually shared with us what nonverbal communications tell us, and we learned that 65% of all communication is in fact nonverbal. So make sure you head back to the previous 2 episodes and listen to those prior to listening to this one, so you kind of get the whole story. Today we're going to talk about the face, the fingers, and just complete kind of the story of nonverbal communications, okay? So let's just jump right in. In this section, like I said, we'll talk about fingers first, and then we'll finish up with face after. So the first thing you want to know, and you may have even noticed it in yourself, is that our brains are geared to focus on people's hands and wrists, okay? It's just something that we're automatically drawn to as humans. People, myself included, if you've seen me in any of my actual videos, when I'm standing in my studio, then you know I tend to use my hands a lot. And what I found out in reading the book is people that often use their hands tend to be more persuasive. Interestingly enough, if you've probably ever taken a public speaking course of any sort, then one of the big things they focus on is on your hands. If you've ever, in fact, watched people on the news or on SportsCenter or whatever you might watch, you'll notice they're generally always holding a pen in their hand. And that's to keep them from doing stupid things with their hands. So hands, very, very important. In fact, something that he covered, and I don't mean to say this, to freak people out or anything like that, but Hitler practiced in front of a mirror and even videoed just his hand gestures, all in order to practice how to use them to enthrall and control his audience. And obviously, it's undisputed that he was probably one of the most persuasive speakers of our entire history. So one of the practices we teach our students is that when they first start in business, no matter what it is to do a video day challenge. We do a 90-day video challenge. And the reason we do that is because when you see yourself on video, you start noticing a lot of the things that you do that you were completely unaware of. The way you hold your hands, the way you hold your body, or your shoulders down, is your head in, are you out and open? Are you really nervous and shy? All these things you start realizing about yourself, and that gives you ammunition to go and correct them. And that in turn gives you more confidence, allows you to be a better speaker, obviously, but more than that, gives you the confidence that when you're in public or meeting new people, you know yourself in a whole new way. So if you've never done that, I recommend you take this 90-day video challenge for yourself, because the results that people produce and the confidence that they build out of just these quick 90-day videos is absolutely incredible. Now, if you don't know how to use your hands properly, and when he kept talking about this in the book, I don't know if you guys have seen Talladega Nights, movie with Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly. There's a scene there when John C. Reilly is being interviewed, and he doesn't know what to do with his hands, and so he just keeps moving them up to his face, and the broadcaster keeps pushing him down. He's like, I don't know what to do with my hands. So I don't know. I just kept thinking of that. Maybe that's not funny to you guys at all. But anyway, if you don't know what you're doing with your hands, you can really hurt your interaction. That's the main takeaway here. So people even think that you might be suspicious if you tend to hide your hands, for example. And we'll talk about that, people that put their hands behind their back or in their pockets. our limbic brain again senses that as suspicious. So just some things to keep in mind. Now, a quick note about shaking hands, and this to me kind of was a little bit strange. I'd never heard this, but you know the way politicians shake hands is when they kind of put their hand, they shake your hand and then they put the other one on top. Now, I do this here and there, and after reading the book, I kind of became much more aware of it. Joe says specifically, don't shake like politicians do by putting one hand on top of the other person's hand, because he says you're conveying dominance, which is not what you should be doing when you first interact with someone. Now, I actually asked a lot of people about this after I shook their hand that way, kind of just to test it and see, how it made them feel. And most of the responses that I got were that people thought it was an added level of affection versus a dominance. So granted, I'm not saying, obviously Joe knows way more about this than I do, but it was just something that I kind of tested for myself, and the results that I was receiving, and maybe it's just because of a personality thing, or maybe these people know me from somewhere else. It doesn't matter, but the response wasn't that I was trying to dominate them, but they actually looked at it as affectionate. Another display that is universally unliked by all human beings is being pointed at. It is one of the least favored things of any human being, especially when done with the index finger. So if you have to do it at all, okay, make sure, Joe says, to do it with your palm facing up and just pointing this way, which is much more diffusing to the person. It's not personal to them. It's just you're actually pointing to something. This especially goes for interactions with your children, which I found really interesting because I have a almost 3-year-old and slightly over 1-year-old. And he says they'll actually focus more on your hands than on your speech. So you have to be very, very careful, because if the limbic brain, keep in mind, the child doesn't need to understand what happens, but the limbic brain, which has been pre-programmed for millions of years, addresses pointing as some sort of threat, domination, etc. And so you don't want to leave your kids feeling that way. So keep that in mind. I know it's going to be a super hard habit to break. I've been practicing it, and it's not very easy, especially when you're like pointing to different things around the room, right? It's so natural for us to just point the way we've taught. So I'm really trying to kind of reprogram my brain, which will take a little bit of time. Okay, so now that we've covered a little bit of that, again, let's go into some of the high and low confidence hand displays. And we'll start with a high confidence hand display. The first Joe calls steepling. Steepling is basically when you do this, okay? Which is basically every finger touches every other finger, but your palms are not touching, okay? So you kind of create that steeple effect. If you've ever seen any public speaker, they use this. Joe says it's only used by people who are very confident in themselves and in their thoughts. So it's natural that probably every public speaking course will teach you this, right? Now, interestingly enough, when we lose confidence in what we're talking about, we'll go from steepling to the ever popular fingers interlaced. So if you watch people transition from this to this, then you know that when they did this, what they're talking about at that moment, they are not as confident in as what they were previously talking about. So good thing to know if you're in a business meeting, for example, and someone's sharing something with you and they do that and you notice it, then you know that there's something there that they're not certain about. Really, really great tip. Another one, which is obvious to most of us, is the thumbs up. Like when we go like this is a high confidence display, indicative of positive behavior, pretty easy. But when we put our thumbs in our pockets, okay, which Joe calls disappearing thumbs, that's actually a very low confidence display. So he just says to do this small exercise, which is try putting your thumbs in your pockets and just see how you feel. So I did this personally, and I gotta tell you, what you start noticing if you're really aware of your body is your shoulders will kind of come down, you droop. It just alters your being. And I remember when I did the Tony Robbins course, he was talking about this part, like the sternum part, that when you hold it up, like literally push it up and open your chest and stand that way, you actually feel powerful. I mean, think about, if an athlete or a boxer or something's about to go in the ring, what do we do, right? We puff out our chest almost like a lion. Putting my thumbs in my pockets was the closest thing that I can come to that is the opposite of that motion. So just try it out for yourself, and you can kind of see how these different hand displays and body postures and everything can truly affect the way you think, feel, and operate in any given moment. Now, another display generally used by males, as Joe would pointed out, is the thumbs in belt buckles. The scientific name he gave it is genital framing. It says to those around you, I'm a viral male, kind of like the Fonz used to do. But interestingly enough, I've seen this happen a lot more in social interactions, like bars in New York City or clubs, etc., where guys will actually do that. So just something to keep in mind. Now, a good rule of thumb, no pun intended here, is people that move a lot when they're speaking are usually telling the truth. And this goes back to the whole thing with the fight. All my friends and I, most of the time, get the answer of face, right? And it's really funny because the face is something that we as humans are programmed to be fully aware of, right? That's where people's speech comes out of. That's where people's facial expressions. So we look a lot to that to gauge what that person is saying, and we use that face to actually interpret what they mean. Because someone can say the same line, right? And just by the look on their face, you can tell if they're being sarcastic, if they're being honest, if they're being playful, etc. So we're honed in on that. And here's the crazy scientific part. The fact is, we're never taught this, okay? But every human being can observe and understand over 10,000 facial expressions. Never taught. No one sits down and says, okay, this means this and this means that. And yet we can comprehend and observe 10,000 facial expressions. Incredible, right? So as we discussed in part one, the reason our faces are not honest is that we've been taught to lie with them from a very young age, right? And we shared some of those examples. So, smile at someone you don't like, or, put on a happy face. All of these things we've been taught from a very young in clusters, right? That we've discussed before. In other words, look at the face and other parts of the body to look and see what the brain is actually reacting to. Don't just use the face, which is something I think we've all been programmed to do. That's because we've all seen someone say positive words, but his face said something completely different. And even though the words were perfect, did you ever have an interaction with a salesperson where they've said everything perfectly, and yet something in your gut told you not to trust this person? We've all had that experience, whether it was a car salesman, a vacuum salesman, someone trying to sell you on a class, whatever. You've all had that kind of experience. So ask yourself why. Like, what is it that innately had you figure out that something wasn't honest about this person, all right? Now, other times we may miss facial expressions because we've been taught not to stare, and we're self-conscious of doing so. So we may miss something like a jaw tightening at a business meeting because we don't want to stare at the person giving the presentation. Okay? You may miss someone sweating or wiping their brow or touching their face because we've been told don't stare. So you got to unlearn that thing. And you got to be willing. If you ever notice poker players, right? They are constantly staring at each other because they know that a slight twitch is the thing that's going to make or break their hand that game. So you got to be able to get out of that mindset of staring is bad. There's obviously a fine line to this, but I'm just saying for most of us, we're afraid to even look at people's eyes. We're afraid to look at people. So you got to unlearn that to be able to observe and truly observe. Now, a really easy, high comfort display that you can very, very easily pick out is when someone has a really relaxed face and they actually tilt their head slightly. So when someone tilts their head, by doing this, they reveal the most vulnerable part of our neck, okay? And it's only done when we're very, very comfortable in the situation. In fact, one of the exercises that Joe shares is try to get into an elevator with a whole bunch of strangers and hold your neck tilted for the entire ride. Very, very difficult to do because, again, an elevator full of strangers is not a comfortable situation for you. Just like we discussed with women, right? If they'll have their legs crossed in an elevator and a stranger will walk in, they will immediately open their legs to gain that balance, right? So they're not vulnerable. Now, let's talk a little bit about the eyes. Nonverbal displays of the eyes are great if you can notice them because we have very, very little control over them. Generally, the eyes will constrict when they're uncomfortable, okay? Now, again, this means that you would have to actually pay attention to people's eyes and be willing to look into their eyes. So Joe ran an interrogation that he shared, and they had this one gentleman in the interrogation room who they knew was part of this crime, but they also knew that there were two other people that he had worked with, and he wasn't willing to share their names. So Joe devised this plan. He made cards with all, I think, 32 people's names or something like that, and wanted to see the guy's reaction. They just told him to literally flip through the cards. And Joe was watching on a video camera directed at the guy's eyes, and his eyes constricted on two particular names. So Joe knew right away that these were his accomplices. They brought the people in, sure enough, they interrogated them, and sure enough, they were involved in the crime. And to this day, the witness or the guy that they were originally interrogating has no idea how they were ever able to find out. And it was just because Joe knew this trick about looking at people's eyes. So pretty incredible stuff. Another one to look for is arched eyebrows, which is another high confidence display. So remember we spoke about gravity defying displays, anything that defies gravity, right? Thumbs up defies gravity, hands up, moving a lot defies gravity, eyebrows up defies gravity. So when you do that, that means a person's confident, they're happy, they're comfortable, they're in a great situation. Now, on the flip side of that, right, lowering means discomfort or low confidence behavior. And if the eyebrow goes too low, it means that someone is very insecure about something. So again, get a baseline of the person, you ask certain questions, and you know that when they're answering certain questions, if you're now attuned and observing what's happening on the face, you can start to tell if a person's honest, dishonest, trying to hide something, etc. Now, this was part of the book that I thought was absolutely fascinating, and the display is called eye blocking. It's something that we've all witnessed. It's something that we've all done. It's when we literally just close our eyes for a few seconds, either with our hands or just close them, right? It's a way that we kind of check out for that moment. So most of the time, it's when we've heard really bad news. We've all done it, right? Now, here's the stuff that I thought was absolutely insane. It's so innate that children in the womb will actually close their eyes when they hear a loud noise. I'll say that again. Children in the womb actually close their eyes when they hear a loud noise. That's how innate this is. Now, crazier than that is blind children. Children who are born blind will still cover their eyes when they hear bad news. Incredible, right? There's no sight, there's nothing to block out, and yet they will still do this and cover their eyes when they hear bad news. I just thought that was absolutely insane. So the key is to look for eye blocking occurring at the moment when you deliver a certain piece of information. So if you're in a business meeting again, or in a social setting, and you say something, and the person holds their eyes closed for a more than average time, in other words, you know, if someone has dry eyes and they've been doing this all night, then that doesn't mean anything. But if you share some piece of news with someone and they close their eyes for a prolonged period of time, then you know that that news has some sort of bad or negative effect on that person. Okay? Now, on the flip side of that is what we call eye widening. So like a girl looking at her boyfriend, you know, the bigger the better, right? When they say that kids in love have the big wide-eyed looks on their faces. So if your boss or partner or something opens their eyes wide at you and you shared an idea or whatever it is, that's a really, really great sign to look for, okay? Absolutely the opposite of eye blocking. Now, an interesting fact that seemed very counterintuitive to me was that Joe mentioned that only when we're talking to someone that we're truly comfortable with will we look away into the distance. Now, I thought to myself, okay, and you probably are thinking the same thing. If you're at a dinner date with someone, right, and that person is looking away, you're like, they're disinterested, I'm boring them, right? That's where my brain went. But Joe clarifies this by saying that you can only look away only because you're not threatened by that person. So it doesn't mean that disinterested or bored. Quite on the contrary, it actually will say that they're very comfortable with you. So totally counterintuitive to everything I thought about, but really, really interesting nonetheless. All right, so here's the last few tips on eyes, and then we'll wrap this trilogy up, okay? First, when people look down, it's not because they're bored or uninterested. A downward gaze is representative of a person processing information, or sometimes they even use it to show respect, kind of like bowing, right? And lastly, people do not like it when your eyes move all around the room, okay? So, particularly on job interviews or big important meetings, okay? Don't look around the room. Keep your focus on the person that you're speaking to or the person speaking in the room. I know this is kind of straightforward, but something very good to be aware of anyway. Eyes darting around the room will lead people to think that you're suspicious, bored, etc. Keep your eyes focused. So that, my friend, puts a bow on my golden nuggets takeaways from Joe Navarro's What Everybody is Saying. Like I said before, if you've enjoyed these synopsis, I highly, highly recommend his book. Obviously, he goes much deeper than I'm able to on these short little podcasts. He's got pictures, he's got charts. So I'll, again, leave the resources for you so you can do that on your own. And again, I will have Joe on here live as an interview. So here's my recommendation. If you've listened to these 3 parts, your questions can be heard. In other words, leave your questions, and when I get Joe on the interview, I will actually ask your questions and I will point you out that you were the ones that sent that question. So make sure to leave those questions. Again, you can go to iTunes, leave a comment, say, I really love this section. I would love to know what Joe thought about this. And in that way, I can find it there. Okay? So I hope you've really enjoyed this podcast trilogy series. I'm in the middle of 2 books right now that I'll share with you guys shortly, but I'm going to dive into Joe's newer book as well after that. So again, if you've loved this information on these particular podcasts and know anyone that's dealing with sales or person-to-person skills or anyone that's just interested in learning about nonverbal communication, please share these podcasts with them. I share them all the time on Facebook. You can share them with your friends. Let them know on iTunes that you're listening to this. And that is the way that iTunes know that this is a popular podcast that people should be listening to. So if you want to give back, don't send us money. Just leave a rating and a comment. And that's how we know that you appreciate what we're putting out there. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I'll see you on the next podcast. Until then, have an amazing, amazing day.